one day I was sitting there and I was thinking about my experience at Apple versus my experience at Google. And, with Apple, my experience was very siloed. You didn't necessarily know what another team was doing. There wasn't, you had to have a good reason to be able to look at the information that they had access to and the knowledge they had access to. Google was completely different. Google, pretty much everything was open. There was very little that was hidden. You could do an internal Google search and find all sorts of information that other teams were using, right? It could be about products that were under development, that sort of thing. And, the upside was great. You could find answers, to related problems perhaps, but there was also so much information that it was overwhelming. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack sometimes.
Hmm.
And so I think, where Apple was siloed and had a little bit more control, yeah, you could find things a little bit easier. But at the same time, you may not find what you're looking for because it was locked away someplace else.
Hello, welcome to the CX Files. Today's guest is Martin Hobratschk. He is the CEO of Cognita Knowledge Management and is a 25-year veteran of knowledge management with a wealth of experience. His work background covers a range of industries, including at leading companies like Google, Nest, Apple, IBM, as well as the American Cancer Society. He's passionate about communication and sharing knowledge because it is the key to success across all organizations. Martin, thanks for joining.
Glad to be here, Ben.
So I always like to ask my guests about their past and understand sort of where they're coming from. So if you could share with us what is one of your early experiences in customer experience, good or bad?
My earliest experiences in customer experience, good or bad. I probably a bad experience early on that taught me to be patient. I was working for Apple, and I was a phone agent, and I was actually working from home. It was one of Apple's first forays into work from home. And I got a customer who is a celebrity who shall remain nameless. And I was excited. I saw the name pop up. I was like, oh, cool, the celebrity. And the celebrity was very rude
Mm,
and was blaming me for his problems with his MacBook. And, I just had to remain patient and, work through the issue. I don't know if we actually got it resolved or not. I think he pretty quickly demanded to speak to, a supervisor. And so we went through that process. But yeah, that was kind of an early exposure into, like, you never know who people are, and you never know who you're going to get at the other end of that line.
absolutely. I think that's a little bit of a nervous moment when you're, opening a new call or opening a new ticket and you're sort of reacting to this person. It could be anybody. They could have any kind of personality, and you have to be ready for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of those things that, it all boils down to the soft skills, right? And those soft skills are, um, you know, things you can train to an extent, but also a bit of just, who you are as a person, and can you deploy those soft skills, right? It's definitely not something that you can catalog in a knowledge base. You're not going to, create a knowledge base article that says, when presented with angry celebrity, here's the steps you follow, right?
Right. Yeah, well, I think that is a kind of a fantasy or a dream state for a knowledge base, right? That it could, react to or respond or cover, emotion, right? Special circumstances beyond the standard case.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you can get a little bit of the way there. You can have, what I like to call recommended responses. I don't like the word script. I think that's too kind of confining, but you can have, recommended responses for situations. And now with agent assist technologies, and AI being able to listen in on a call and say, hey, here's a recommended response. You can kind of get part of the way there, but it's not going to be perfect, right? And you really aren't going to be able to replace, you know, just human intuition and human, skill with recommendations from AI, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, without a doubt, a value in human to human connection, which will not be replaced by AI. And, I think a big part of it is beyond like a tactical or kind of a practical understanding, there's a feeling of understanding that you get when you speak to another human. And that has a value.
Yeah. Well, it's empathy, right? That's that
Right,
empathy and being able to kind of understand how somebody feels, understand why they're angry, understand why they're frustrated and yelling at you and demanding a supervisor, right?
right,
Having that empathetic response is a human condition, right? And it's not something that I don't think we're going to ever be able to, train, a computer to be able to do that. It might be able to mimic it. It might be able to say, here's what I think the correct response is, but it's not the same as, having that empathetic, ability.
right, right. So you've worked across a range of big names, famous. We called out a few of them in the beginning,
Yeah.
famous companies, and you started in frontline support, but obviously you've transitioned and progressed in your career over the past 25 years. And I wanted to hear a little bit about some of those transitions between companies or between roles. If you could share any stories or lessons that were memorable there.
You know, one of the things that stood out to me I left Apple and went to Nest shortly after Nest got acquired by Google. And this is a realization I didn't have until I'd been kind of a few years in the Googleplex, as it is called. Nest. When I joined Nest, it was still very much in startup mode, and it was only after a few years that it really got more fully absorbed into the Google devices team. But when I was with the devices team, yeah, there was one day I was sitting there and I was thinking about my experience at Apple versus my experience at Google. And, with Apple is my experience was very siloed. You didn't necessarily know what another team was doing. There wasn't You had to have a good reason to be able to look at the information that they had access to and the knowledge they had access to. Google was completely different. Google, pretty much everything was open. There was very little that was hidden. You could do an internal Google search and find all sorts of information that other teams were using, right? It could be about products that were under development, that sort of thing. And, you know, the upside was great. You could find answers, to related problems perhaps, but there was also so much information that it was overwhelming. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack sometimes.
Hmm.
And so I think, where Apple was siloed and had a little bit more control, yeah, you could find things a little bit easier. But at the same time, you may not find what you're looking for because it was locked away someplace else.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think that lines up, with my sense as an outsider. I mean, I've never worked at Google or Apple, but my understanding of Google is that their mission is to organize the world's information. So
Yeah.
it sort of makes sense internally to make that accessible as well. Yeah, I guess I'm curious if there was a moment for you when you went from frontline to knowledge base, or you went from, that frontline role to maybe a management role. Could you talk to that point a little bit?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a transition. I had at Apple moved from doing the CPU support to working on the developer support team. So Apple has had a developer support team since the very early days, and the developer support team was really focused on the Mac OS. And then with the introduction of the iPhone in 2008, the decision was made, well, we need to have developer support for the developers of iPhone. And at the time, they were essentially outsourcing it to a vendor team to do the support, and it was just all email support, and it was a huge backlog, and it was just a horrible experience for everybody. And so they started up a developer support team, and I was one of the first folks hired onto that. And again, just kind of doing tier one developer support, basically helping with enrolling developers into the developer program. It wasn't technical support. And, from there I moved up. I went from tier one to tier two to tier three. We were called content training support engineers. And when I got that tier three level, that's when I was involved in helping to document the processes for the team in the knowledge base. But I also was training the team and helping ramp up some new sites in Europe. And that's where I really, kind of started down the path of just doing knowledge management as my main type of job. Because to me, training is very closely related to knowledge management. I tend to group it as a function of knowledge management. A lot of folks in the learning and development industry may not agree with me on that, but they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Training is, you train somebody just in case they might need the knowledge. Knowledge management is about just in time. You need that answer right then. You need to find it right, and so they have to work hand in hand, right? And so that was, I think that's given me a really interesting perspective on knowledge management, because I see it as one sort of holistic thing. The learning and development part and the knowledge management part, again, are two sides of the same coin. And I've always worked very closely with the training team, because it's crucial to expose folks to the knowledge assets you have in your knowledge base as a part of the training. You need to basically train them where to look for those answers, right? Because they're never going to be able to remember it, right? And so you have to, develop those knowledge assets alongside the training so that they are complementary to each other. And so that's sort of I don't know if it's a unique point of view, but it's not something that I come across a whole lot when I'm talking to other knowledge management practitioners.
Definitely. I think of it as sort of, teaching people to teach themselves, right?
Yeah.
And as you moved from tier one to three and into more of a sort of a process creation role, sort of a documentation building role, was there was there a moment or maybe at a period of time where you felt like, okay, knowledge management is really underrated. Like this is really the thing that we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, honest with you, I had that insight years before when I
Hmm.
was at IBM. I was a customer service manager. So my very, very deep background is, when I went to college and I graduated from college, I was a newspaper reporter. I was going to be a journalist. And so from, that's, in hindsight, that's a very much a knowledge management type of job, right? I left that for various reasons. And then when I was at IBM, I was really looking to move back into, how do I leverage these skills as a tech writer or as a writer, in this technical organization. And that's when I started becoming aware of knowledge management. I was like, okay, this is maybe a direction I want to go in, right? But it was only a few years later when I was with Apple that I was actually able to make that change and say, okay, yeah, this knowledge management function is is really crucial for the organizational success, because the team that I was on, that developer support team, they had some processes, but they didn't have a lot of processes. So we had to do documentation of those. And so I would interview various folks about, what do you do? It was, again, it was just like being a newspaper reporter,
Hmm.
just slightly different focus. And, interviewing lots of different people, not just the people who were doing the job or were doing the process, but, you know, the management and getting their input and saying, well, is this the way you want the process to work? Do you see any potential problems with the way this process is outlined, right? And so that's when I really was like, okay, the light bulb went off. It's like, this is something I need to really, I guess, invest in more for myself and learn more about, and is the path that I want to pursue. And from that point, that's when I was really like, okay, knowledge management is now my career. It's not tech support, it's knowledge management within that technical or customer support area.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like, you know, knowledge management, it sounds kind of intimidating on the surface. It sounds so broad in scope. Can you maybe, for people out there who are aware of it but maybe haven't sunk their teeth in yet, like, could you give some concrete, like, either examples of things people can do to kind of to open that door, or maybe some concrete kind of results that you've seen as well?
Yeah. I think, you hit the nail on the head that knowledge management can seem kind of broad. I think too that there's an awful lot of people don't even know what knowledge management is.
Right.
And so, I think for me, and I think the definition is different for everybody, but for me, knowledge management is empowering people to create and share the knowledge that they need to solve problems. So that's a pretty generic sort of definition, and that can apply to a lot of different functions. A knowledge base is one of those functions. A knowledge base is a library essentially of different types of knowledge assets. Usually articles of how to solve a problem, right, or maybe a policy or something like that. Um, but other types of knowledge management activities are things like communities of practice, bringing people together to talk about what they're doing. Knowledge retention programs. How do you capture knowledge that people have about how a company works or their job before they leave, whether they're, retiring or they're laid off or they pursue other opportunities. How do you capture that, right? Those are kind of the three big ones, but there's so much more. Learning management systems are akin to knowledge bases, and there's some library connotations to that as well. Really, any kind of activity that is right at that nexus of getting tacit knowledge from inside people's heads or capturing tacit knowledge, that arises from interactions, and and documenting that so that other people can access it and making that knowledge explicit. That that's really where knowledge management happens, right? In any kind of activity like that, right? And so, my main focus has always been customer service contact center, technical support contact center. And knowledge management is especially powerful and especially useful there for for those teams to be able to access that knowledge, and not just um, in the sense that, okay, a customer has a problem and I have to give them the solution. That's the big win, and that could be maybe tied back to customer satisfaction, right? But if you think about it, those knowledge management systems or the existence thereof has implications for a whole host of other things, such as employee retention. Because if you don't have a good, solid knowledge base that an employee can refer to, they're going to get very frustrated with the job because they don't feel like they're effective. And so they're going to leave. Or, or onboarding time. If you don't have a good, solid knowledge base, it can take a lot longer for somebody to become proficient at their jobs. One of the clients I worked with, one of my very early clients as a consultant, came to me and they said, we don't have a knowledge base and it takes us 16 weeks to onboard a new contact center agent. And we want to put a knowledge base in place because we know that that's going to help us reduce that. And so we were able to put that in place, and that did, rather significantly reduce the amount of time with onboarding, because what they were seeing was, the new agents would come on and all the knowledge was, held by these very tenured employees. And so those new agents would have to know who the employee was if they couldn't find the answer, and go find that employee and bug them, and get the solution from them. And that just added time to the resolution. It was very frustrating for everybody involved, right? And so by implementing a knowledge base, they were able to reduce that frustration for all the employees. They were able to speed up the time it took for somebody to become proficient. They were able to improve the speed of time it took for a customer to get an answer. So there were so many knock-on effects by just implementing a very simple knowledge base.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, those are some great examples too. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about all of these points of friction without the knowledge base, right? The the employee that leaves and brings the knowledge in their head, with them, right? The new employee that doesn't have the knowledge in their head. The tenured experienced employee who has to stop what they're doing to answer a question, to transmit what's in their head to the junior. These are all points of friction that are solved by having a good, effective knowledge base. I think of it as like, bridges with toll booths on them, right? And every time the knowledge has to cross a bridge, there's a cost, right? It's time. And so I think that hopefully this is, listening to your response and to this podcast, people can start to visualize and make more concrete the cost of these points of friction.
Yeah. 100%. That's key, right? Companies, organizations, teams, even individuals who are starting to look at this problem is to, obviously start off with an assessment and kind of figure out where you're at. What does your technology look like? What are your people? What are the processes you have? But use that assessment to help craft a strategy. You know, what are you going to do, in the next 6 months? What are you going to do in the next year? What are you going to do in the next 2 years? What are you going to do in the next three? Have a roadmap for how you're going to, you know, improve all this, right? Because it's not going to be something you can do overnight, and it can be very overwhelming to start off say, okay, we're going to do knowledge management, and we're not sure exactly what we're going to do about knowledge management. We're going to do something about it, and it's always more than just, okay, we're going to put a knowledge base in place. We're going to go and invest in this tool and have, we're going to put all our knowledge in there and we're going to be good. Well, that knowledge needs to be managed. It needs to be curated. And so you need to have a plan for how you're going to do that, right? And, there's discoverability questions. Yeah, there's search, but how is that knowledge going to integrate with your AI tools? What teams are actually going to be able to leverage this knowledge? Because most organizations will have many, many knowledge bases. They've got lots of different silos, and again, it needs to be strategic in how you address that, because having lots of silos is like having a giant digital landfill, just a bunch of stuff in there that nobody can find anything because it's just so spread out. They don't know where to look, right?
Right.
But also trying to condense everything into one single point of truth can be a bit overwhelming too. So you got to understand, what maybe it's not a single point of truth, but maybe it's, you know, 3 or 4 points of truth, but they're well managed, right? And there's some sort of system to where they're talking to each other and they're integrated, right? So, but again, you can't do any of this without having a really thoughtful strategy about how you're going to get there.
Right. Understand the reality, make a practical plan, and then go forward. So, one of the things that is a recurring theme on this podcast is this idea of internal salesmanship. And how do
Hmm.
you win support for the initiative? You see the value, from your
Yeah.
experience that it's absolutely worthwhile to do, but you have to convince others. And I know you're the CEO of Cognita Knowledge Management, and so you've got some perspective as a business owner, but also, just for people out there, like, how would you recommend or how would you advise people go about, selling these kinds of initiatives internally?
It's very simple. I think it boils down to a concept that a lot of folks are going to be familiar with. You know, just tell people what's in it for them. How is this going to help them? How is this going to help them save money? How is this going to help them help customers faster? How is this going to help them find the answers that they need? How is it going to make their job easier, right? That's the place to start. is just, very simple. What's in it for me? And being able to communicate that. With knowledge management, especially in a contact center space, I think it's really crucial to involve the front line as much as possible, um, in not just kind of helping to chart the path that you're going to be following and the tools that they're going to use, but in actually creating and sharing and curating that knowledge so it becomes a function of their job. Because if if you just treat your knowledge base as kind of a set it and forget it thing, where you've got, you know maybe some SMEs who work with tech writers to put content in, or even just have SMEs tell them, go ahead and put the content in there. It's over the long term, it's going to get left behind. It's going to stagnate because people aren't taking an active role in kind of curating that knowledge, right? And so I think it's really key to involve everybody, because at the end of the day, knowledge management isn't something you do for people or do to people. Sorry, you don't do it to people, you do it for them, right?
Right.
And but they need to be involved in doing that for themselves, right? And I think with by getting that involvement and showing, what's in it for them, I think that's really the key to having a successful knowledge management initiative.
Absolutely. That's like a story I heard from my dad who has a marketing background, but he said, everybody's tuned into WIFM radio, which is what's in it for me.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's 100%. It's just pure, human nature, that
Right.
if you can show somebody what's in it for them, they'll be like, okay, yeah,
Right.
I'm definitely interested. If they don't, then they're just going to be like, yeah, I don't really care about that.
Yeah. I understand. Here's this thing that you want, and here's how this new project is going to help you get it. Right.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So, I mean, I think that's something practical that people can take away, and whatever, whether it's knowledge management or AI or whatever initiatives they've got going on, that's something that they can use. When you look at, your past experience with, deploying knowledge management, whether it's tools or a new initiative or process, there's this transition that goes from, that people go through, right? So they start in frontline support and they're responding to tickets, they're taking calls, doing emails, and then they transition into being writers, or at least partially. Part of their
Hmm.
responsibilities become writing and curating, creating the knowledge base. Can you tell us some stories about that transition and sort of maybe some challenges and opportunities there?
For me, it was pretty simple, because I had that writing background.
Right.
But not everybody has that writing background, right? And how do you empower somebody to kind of be a writer when maybe that's not the experience they have, and maybe it's not even a desire that they have, or they don't know that they have that desire. So, in the quote unquote old days, it was a matter of, finding folks who had the interest. Maybe they had some background in doing some sort of documentation, and we would, create writing tests and say, okay, here's kind of a situation, write a process about it and see kind of how they handled it, right?
Hmm.
Now, today, that's less of a chore, because there are so many ways to leverage AI to help somebody do that writing, so they don't have to necessarily be a writer. They can just put some notes into a widget, and an AI agent can look at that and format that and say, okay, hey, is this the knowledge article you want? And then have somebody who has the expertise to look at that and review it and sign off on it, right? And so it really can speed up the process and enable folks who maybe in the past really wouldn't have even considered doing something like that to be able to do it and be able to do it pretty effectively.
Absolutely. And that the episode hasn't been published yet. I think it'll be out by the time this one is published. But a previous guest was talking about exactly this point, and they agree with you completely, and I agree as well, which is, you take the subject matter expert, the SME, you take them and you have they have the passion. Maybe they don't have the writing skill. They've got the experience, they've got the passion, and through using these generative AI tools, they can kickstart. They can get that first draft out. They can give it a once over. It can get reviewed and approved before it goes live. But taking them from what's in their head to what's on the page, that gap is smaller than ever, or even non-existent at this point. And so
Hmm.
that's like a real concrete thing that, it's not like a rare capability in the world today. There's a lot of tools that
Yeah.
can do this for you, I think.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is one sign of a transition. I'm using this word a lot today, but I think of like there's a changing landscape, of course, in CX with AI, and there's a changing landscape as far as careers, and a lot of people are rightly concerned about their jobs. But I think that there's as any technology over in history has come out, people have transitioned. They've shifted their focus into using the new tool in a new direction. And this is a big opportunity because now you can, even if you're not a writer by background or by interest perhaps, you can do writing, and
Mhm.
that knowledge base becomes your work. I mean, it's a big part of your work, basically.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that powers up the AI as well. So how do you think about like the changing direction and sort of where things are going, this relationship between, the traditional support role, the knowledge base, and AI?
I think it's constantly evolving. I don't think anybody has a real clear vision of where it's all going to end up, you know. I think it, it definitely holds promise for making it easier for people to do their jobs, and again to be able to share that knowledge. I think that the problem is that there's a lot of fear, is maybe that's the right word, that well, AI is here to replace me, right? And that's not helped by all these executives saying we're gonna replace all of our customer service people
Right.
with AI agents. But I think they're also kind of finding the reality that, yeah, not 100%. And plus, customers, they don't want to work with just AI bots. If they're going to talk to somebody, they want to talk to a human being, right? They want that human empathy, right? They want somebody they can communicate with and not just get sent into an endless loop, right? Um, but so I think that there's a lot of promise for the if implemented in the right way, and you get people involved and give them the tools that are really helpful to them, that can help them do their jobs better and faster. They'll be more inclined to say, yeah, this is something that's good, and this is something that's going to help me, right? uh, One of the things a lot of folks talk about is AI not necessarily replacing everybody's job, but being able to handle kind of, in terms of like customer experience, being able to handle those very simple issues. Yeah, an AI bot can handle a password reset request or something very simple. Uh, the humans to be able to apply their reasoning and cognition to solving the really complex problems that often involve a lot of empathy, because you have a very frustrated customer on the other end of the line, right? I had I had this experience just yesterday. Um, I we had ordered some meds for our pets, and got a message that, oh, it's delayed. You need to talk to your vet. So I called the vet, and it's like, well, we didn't get the notification. Can you call them and tell them to resend us a notification? So I called. It was a voice bot. What is your problem? All this kind of IVR sort of stuff, not getting me anywhere. Finally figured out. I kept asking for a human. It didn't understand. If I just hit zero, I was like, oh, we'll put you in touch with somebody. I was pretty frustrated at this point, just knowing that, okay, this is not going to end the way I want it to end. And, then it was like, yeah, I'm on hold for 40 minutes.
Mm.
At least it gave me the estimated time. So I bailed and I canceled the order and I went with another provider, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, it was just that frustration of dealing with that automated system and not being able to talk to a human quickly, that lost this company in my business, right?
Right.
And
Great.
that's yeah, it's not an uncommon experience, right?
Right.
And so I think that, companies are going to have to figure out how to make these AI systems work in a human way, and be very human, and being able to, you know, understand, what you want to do initially. Because I was telling it exactly what I wanted to do. I was like, I need to have a notification resent to my vet. It didn't understand it. It
Hmm.
just didn't understand it, right?
Right.
And so that's so frustrating. And so I think there's a long way to go for many companies in terms of being able to have those kind of AI capabilities that are going to really work for people, right? I think we're still very early on, despite all the promises from these companies. I think we're very early on in terms of the capability of these systems.
Absolutely. And I work on the discoverability side. And so exactly this kind of challenge that you're talking about, but I'm not going to talk about
Mhm.
what I do today, but as far as, the knowledge base goes and the knowledge management practice goes, that is very much the root of reliable self-service, the root of reliable AI. If you do not have that foundation in place, your chatbot's going to be a disaster. If it's voice or text or whatever, if it's an AI system, it's only as good as the data that it can pull from. And
Yes.
the structure of that data, the clarity of that data, the how up to date is it, and so on. And so all of this points back to having you know a good observation of the reality and a clear strategic plan for knowledge management. Have you talked or heard about this knowledge management for AI, or sort of preparing the knowledge base to be ready for AI? And what do you think about this generally?
Yeah, it's a hot topic right now with knowledge management within the knowledge management community, because of exactly what you said, right? That knowledge base is the foundation for the success of these different tools. And you know, the conversations that I've been having around this are, how do we structure our knowledge base articles so that, you know, AI chatbots can easily find the right information and accurately find the right information, but also so that it's consumable by humans, right? Because you're going to have both types of agents looking at this knowledge, and they need to both be able to easily and quickly understand what it's saying, right? And so, there's some very basic things that apply to both. You need to, have, headers, H2 and H3, use those, have the language be very clear and simple and not too dense, you know, creating question answer pairs, kind of FAQs. There's some debate as to whether those need to be standalone documents or as part of the general document. But, these are all things that AI uses to, find the right information. But it's also stuff that that humans need to be able to really quickly understand these knowledge assets, right?
Right. So to close out the episode here, I wonder if you could make a recommendation or a thought on the future. If you want to give advice to anybody out there, CX leaders, knowledge managers, what would you say are the places to dig, the places to focus on for the future?
The biggest one is, we've talked about it already, is that knowledge governance. How are you ensuring that your knowledge is curated and it's not just stale and static? That is the single most important thing to look at. But in looking at that knowledge governance, you also need to look at the people, right, who are managing the knowledge and using the knowledge, and also the systems that you're using, right? Not every system is created equally. There's a lot of legacy knowledge based systems out there that just aren't really prepared for the future. And to get them to a point that they are going to be ready for the future is going to take a whole lot of effort on your part, right? And so you have to make the decision: do we stick with what we know and spend a lot of time and effort trying to develop it into something that will work for the future, or do we find a new solution that has everything we need, that can easily work, integrate with the content we already got and ingest that content to an extent. But starting with, the governance, who, what, when, where, why of how that knowledge is curated is key.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. Martin, again, is the CEO of Cognita Knowledge Management, and he helps companies and teams to prepare for this future in the right way and deploy a solid knowledge management practice. So, Martin, thanks for joining us today on the CX Files.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
All right, everybody, we'll see you on the next episode.